Hello, I'm Nathan P. Butler, author of a Saga on home video and host of From the Star Wars Home Video Library here on YouTube, and this is Star Wars Home Video Year by Year. This time we take a look at 1978. In the last episode, we looked at 1977. From a home media perspective, it was kind of a big deal. We saw Super 8 reels of selected scenes from A New Hope, then just known as Star Wars, being released on home media. And then we also had, for kids, the Kindle Star Wars Movie Viewer, where you could crank out, literally, some Star Wars viewing. And in other regions, we saw stuff like the Mini Cinex. But of course, that was a big year for Star Wars because that was the year that the original film was released in theaters at all for its first run. The question is, what would then happen in the intervening years between then and when we actually started to see full versions of the film released on home video, which wouldn't happen until 1982. Well, the first year in that gap is 1978, and some big things were going on with Star Wars at the time. To put things in context here, the Marvel Comics series had been doing an adaptation of A New Hope, again, Star Wars at the time, back in 77 that wrapped up before the end of the year and actually launched into some new stories, giving us basically the first expanded universe stories of what would eventually become the Legends continuity. But even then, wasn't treated as a single continuity with the other stuff that was going to be released around it at the time. But that's a whole other thing that I'm sure I've covered on the channel at some point before in one of the chronologically focused episodes. Well, in 1978, we then see the first original novel published as part of that growing universe of Star Wars. Alan Dean Foster had ghostwritten the novelization of the original film that came out at the end of 1976, credited to George Lucas at the time, and he was the one who was brought back in to write the first spin-off novel, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which released in 1978, originally meant to be the possible story of a low-budget sequel if the film just did okay in theaters, and then the film did great. So we don't need it anymore. It came out as a novelization. So Star Wars is growing kind of in the background out there. It is growing in notoriety. And in 1978, it has a theatrical re-release for the first time. Second time in theaters, first re-release. And it fixes something we're going to see as an issue going forward with Star Wars home video, so it's important to note this re-release. During the original theatrical run of the film, there have been different audio versions available out there, mono, stereo, and so on. And within the stereo soundtrack, the primary one we tend to think of with that release, there was a missing chunk of dialogue from C-3PO. They're in the Death Star control room area. They are having R2-D2 plug in to pull up the schematics and everything about the tractor beam. And he's going to make the precise position appear on the monitor. And there's all this dialogue from C-3PO about how they need to kind of have a power loss at one of the terminals to allow the ship to leave and all of that. And as they're having this conversation, the screen is flashing with different parts of the blueprints, and you see the characters like looking thoughtfully at the screen to get a sense of what they need to do to get the heck out of there and escape the Death Star. Except in the stereo track, the explanation didn't exist. As they're looking at the screens and the blueprints and everybody's having those pensive looks, it's just clicking through the sound effects with no dialogue whatsoever. It was an error in that soundtrack. We will see that error will perpetuate in Star Wars home video releases once the film is actually released in full in 1982 for several years until it's fixed on home video. But in theaters, it was fixed for this second run in 1978, which helps us know which version of the audio we would wind up seeing when it gets released in 1982. The presence or lack of that C-3PO line becomes kind of an ongoing thing within Star Wars home video over the years, thanks to this issue in 1977 that was fixed in 1978. More on that when we get to 1982, and especially as we start looking at things like 1984 and 1986. But for 1978, whilst that is being fixed, there's not much on the home market. It all comes back to this sucker. The blaster, right? It all comes back to the Kindle Star Wars Movie Viewer, slap in the cartridge, and crank away to watch about a minute of Star Wars footage. We saw that when this was released in 77, it came with a cartridge. There were also 2 other cartridges released in 1977. In 1978, we see the end of that product line as it expands with 2 more cartridges for a total of 5. Those are Danger at the Cantina, and then the weirdly named Assault on Death Star. Just like we had Destroy Death Star with no the, same thing here, no the. We just have Assault on Death Star, but this is a new release in 78. You'll notice some differences on the cover. I detail these in From the Star Wars Home Video Libraries. Look at these, so check those out. Again, as always, this is meant to be a short series, a burst of chronological information for a particular year to get you interested, to perhaps give a sort of an overview of the year. But if you ever want more information, check out the description of the episode, because I will have links to where you can find this in episodes of From the Star Wars Home Video Library that go much more in depth and point you to where you can find information on these products in either the first or second edition of my Saga on Home Video, which is available on Amazon. Talked about all that in the first episode. So we'll go into detail on the specifics of the packaging in one of those episodes. Suffice to say, things are updated just a little bit. But again, all these are, as we saw before, are just those little red cartridges that you snap into your movie viewer, hold up to the light, look through the lens here, and crank away. But that's it. In 1978, all we really got in the US was just more Star Wars Kenner movie viewer stuff. It wouldn't be until the next year that we would see some releases on new major media formats as part of the growing great format war, as I'm prone to calling it. So, next time, we'll check out the beginnings of Star Wars products on VHS and Beta in 1979.